Why teenagers need risk, and what pain actually teaches the adolescent brain. There's something strange about adolescence. You can tell a teenager that's dangerous. You can explain exactly what could happen. You can give them statistics, warnings, rules, and consequences. And sometimes they will look directly at you and do it anyway. That does not necessarily mean that they're stupid, irresponsible, or incapable of understanding danger. It means their brain is going through a developmental period where exploration, reward, novelty, social experience, and risk have unusually powerful motivational value. And that distinction matters. During adolescence, the system involved in reward and motivation are undergoing substantial development, while the cognitive control systems that help us inhibit impulses and weigh consequences continue developing into young adulthood. So a teenager can genuinely understand that something is dangerous while still experiencing the potential reward as more compelling in the moment. That is part of why simply saying, don't do that, you'll get hurt, doesn't always produce the behavior adults expect. Jordan Peterson has an interesting way of describing this. In the 12 Rules of Life, Peterson's Rule 11 is do not bother children when they are skateboarding. His argument is not literally that adults should ignore dangerous behavior. His broader idea is that young people do not develop competence by having every risk removed from their environment. They develop competence by approaching challenges that contain some uncertainty, some possibility of failure, and some meaningful consequence, and gradually discovering what they can handle. A skateboarder learns balance partly because falling is possible. A climber learns where to put their foot because putting it in the wrong place has an immediate consequence. A teenager learning independence discovers that decisions actually produce outcomes. Peterson's argument is essentially safety cannot come exclusively from removing danger. Some safety comes from becoming competent enough to navigate danger. And there is scientific evidence that partially overlaps with that idea. Research on risky play has distinguished between a risk and a hazard. A risk is something a young person can perceive, evaluate, and gradually learn to manage. A hazard is a danger they may not be capable of recognizing or controlling. Those are not the same thing. Developmentally appropriate risk can provide opportunities for autonomy, physical competence, judgment, confidence, and self regulation. That does not mean allowing children to encounter catastrophic dangers. The objective is not let them get hurt. It is let them encounter manageable difficulty before the world gives them unmanageable difficulty. And this brings us to pain. Pain is one of the most ancient learning styles the nervous system possesses. When an experience produces an aversive outcome, the brain can form an association between cue to behavior to consequence. Touch something painful hot once, and the nervous system becomes very interested in remembering the circumstances surrounding that event. That is associative learning. Fear conditioning research demonstrates that humans and other animals can learn that previously neutral cues predict aversive events. So, yes, pain can make an experience extremely memorable. But this is where we have to scientifically be careful. Something being memorable does not automatically mean it creates better judgment. Adolescents do not simply learn perfectly from punishment. In fact, developmental reinforcement learning research has found that adolescents can sometimes learn more strongly from rewards than from punishment. And some adolescents show reduced behavioral adjustment after negative feedback. One study found that adolescents were less likely than adults to learn effectively from punishment. Another found that adolescents who showed weaker neural response to negative feedback were also less likely to reduce risky behavior afterward. So the common adult assumption is they'll learn when it hurts enough is incomplete. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. And sometimes excessive fear or stress teaches an entirely different lesson than the adult intended. That distinction is critical for parenting. There's a profound difference between natural discomfort and deliberately causing suffering. A scraped knee from learning to ride a bike is not the same as psychological experience as a parent intentionally inflicting pain. Losing spending privileges because you spent irresponsibly is not equivalent to humiliation. Experiencing disappointment after failing to prepare is different from being shamed for failing. The first category allows the adolescent nervous system to connect their own choices to predictable consequences. The second may connect the caregiver to fear. That is why medical organizations, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, advise against physical punishment, humiliation, threatening, and shaming as discipline. Those techniques are not necessary for effective learning and are associated with worse developmental outcomes. So, when we're talking about the developmental value of discomfort, we should not confuse consequences with cruelty. Think of adolescence as a calibration period. The adolescent brain is learning, how fast can I go? How much can I handle? Who can I trust? What happens when I ignore a warning? What happens when I succeed at something difficult? What happens when I fail? And importantly, can I recover afterward? Some of the most valuable lessons of adolescence comes from making a decision, experiencing its real-world consequence, and then being given the opportunity to analyze what happened. That final part really matters. A consequence becomes far more useful when an adult helps turn experience into reflection. Instead of, see, I told you so, try, what did you think was going to happen? What actually happened? What did you miss? What would you do differently next time? Now the adolescent isn't merely experiencing pain, they're constructing a model. And that model is the learning. Peterson's idea becomes more useful when we put those boundaries around it. Don't eliminate every risk. Don't manufacture unnecessary pain either. Instead, give adolescents progressively larger opportunities to encounter challenge, uncertainty, responsibility, consequences, recovery, and reflection. Let them climb, but recognize the difference between a climb and a cliff. Let them fail, but don't engineer humiliation. Let natural consequences exist, but don't confuse suffering with education. Because the goal of parenting isn't to create a child who never encounters danger. Eventually, you will not be standing beside them. The goal is to help develop a young adult who can encounter danger and think, I've dealt with uncertainty before. I know how to evaluate this. I know my limits. I know when to stop. And if I make a mistake, I know how to learn from it. That is something much more durable than obedience. That is competence.